now the pleasure of introducing yet another breakthrough thinker, Professor Nirvikar Singh. Professor Singh is a distinguished professor at the University of Santa Clara, University of California at Santa Clara. He is, Santa Cruz, I apologize, sorry, UC Santa Cruz. He is a professor of economics there. He also has done lots of other stuff. You know, when I was talking to him about how to introduce him, he asked me to scale it down. He said that's all he wanted to hear, so he did not want me to talk about the hundreds of papers he's researched. I won't tell you that. He did not want to tell you, me to tell you about all the wonderful work he's done in London School of Economics, so I won't do that. He didn't ask me to tell you about all of the awards he received from the government of India and other places. So I won't tell you that, but instead I will welcome Professor Singh to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. You all must be ready for the Nobel Prize winner, but I'll just keep you for 15 minutes. This is the title of a book that my co-authors and I have written. They're both in Philadelphia, so I got the privilege of being here. This is really the first comprehensive account of our community, your community. And it's a data-driven study, so I'm just going to give you a flavor of it very quickly. So the slides will go quickly, but it'll give you a sense of what's coming. The book will be out in 6 months. And really what I want to say is actually the only breakthrough that we've achieved is telling the story of your breakthrough. So that's really what this book is about. So I just want to mention that this originated with a grant from the Government of India, the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs, which now, of course, has been folded into another ministry, to CASI, the Center for the Advanced Study of India, which is directed by my co-author, Devesh Kapoor. So this is just an outline of the talk, and again, I'll just give you a really overview of what's in the book. This is really our motivation. How did a population from a poor developing nation with low human capital become the most educated and highest income group in the world's most advanced nation in a single generation? That's the question that we answer. And you can see that in this slide. I know the print is a little, type is a little small, but we've looked at every single immigrant group we could track. And there's India in the top right-hand corner. The axes are education and income, basically. So that's the outcome that we want to explain. So just a little bit of history. Immigration to the United States has a long history. There were waves in the 19th century, the Northern European wave, the Southern European wave, and then there's a big gap before the modern wave, which is much more diverse. And that gap involved actually completely banning immigration from India for several decades. That was the Asiatic barred zone. This is a picture of how the population has grown. And basically, for several decades, because of immigration policy, it was static. And it really started to grow after 1965. This is a log scale, so you can't quite see how dramatic the growth has been, but I'll make it clear. So the policymakers either didn't realize or didn't want to acknowledge what the Immigration Act of '65 was going to do. The Secretary of State made this statement that the number of immigrants from India would stay quite small. And instead, we had this pattern. We've periodized immigration from India to the US into these 3 periods. And you can see that there's acceleration from the first period to the second period. And the third period, the IT generation, as we call it, is really quite dramatic. And this is a similar graph, with similar information. It just shows you year by year what that pattern has been like. You can see Y2K in there. And you can also see on this graph how immigrants then become residents, permanent residents of the US. In fact, now, or 2014, the latest year for which we have data, India is actually the largest source of new immigrants. Presumably, this is legal immigrants that we can measure to the US, and the second largest source of total immigrants. So just ahead of China and Mexico. By 2014, the India-born population at 2.2 million was the second largest, When you add in the population from who were born in the US and born in other countries, Indian origin population, we get a little over 3 million, which is the 1% of our title, the other 1%. So we are now 1% of the US population. So a little bit about characteristics. Who are we? About 60% were born in India, 28% in the US, another 12, 13% born elsewhere. We have a complete breakdown of where they came from. This is census data. We also know the languages they speak, the most common languages, Hindi, Gujarati, Telugu, Punjabi, Tamil. This is in 2012. I'll come back to that. There's actually quite a divide between the Indian-born and the US-born Indian population, and that, of course, reflects the fact that many Indians have come recently to the US. So the US-born population actually is very young, and if we look at the Indian-born population, it stands out in particular compared to the mainstream because of the high level of education. So they're really two different classes of two different groups, the Indian-born and the US-born. So Indian Americans are really outliers. They have a strong occupational concentration in tech work, professional services, IT, computers. They've typically come through employment, and they have the highest levels of educational attainment and income in the US among all foreign and native-born groups. So they really stand out. But it is a heterogeneous community. There's actually increasing variation among the ethnic groups, and you can see some of the recent changes by the fact that actually the 2012 figures have changed. Telugu has overtaken Tamil has overtaken Gujarati, and Tamil has overtaken Punjabi in terms of the ordering. So it reflects the different regional pattern of recent migration versus the earlier migrations. This gives you a sense of where Indian Americans are, and the main thing I want to say is that wherever they are in the US, their average income and education their average income is higher than that of the total population. So again, they stand out in this respect. This shows some variation by education and variation of education and income by ethnicity. Again, you can see that Tamil and Telugu, reflecting the recent IT-driven migration, are at the upper right. And nevertheless, if you look at the axes, the horizontal, if you look at the vertical axis, you'll see that the average family income of any group, given its level of education, is higher than the average for the US. Now, turning to some particular examples, the professions have really been quite important. Medical graduates were, in fact, the frontier. And at one stage in the early 70s, 10% of entering doctors being added were from India. And they, in some ways, were trailblazers for all Indian Americans. We have a lot in the book on entrepreneurship. That's probably the topic that you know most about. We've looked at high-tech entrepreneurs, but we've also looked at entrepreneurs across the spectrum. Interestingly, for the more educated, they're not more likely to be entrepreneurs, except really at the top end in high-tech, and also at the lower end in occupations which require less education. And really, the lower end doesn't do better than average. So again, a lot of the story here is education. We have similarly, we've mapped gender differences and educational attainment. What you see here is that actually the gender differences that came with the Indian-born are actually going away in the second generation. We know where you live. We have detailed census data. We can map Indian Americans by county, by neighborhood, and by language. So we have a really good sense of where we are as a community. We also have mapped Indian American voting patterns. This is very interesting because Indian Americans actually don't vote the way that the rest of the population does. As income normally rises, people vote more Republican. That's not true for Indian Americans. There's a very strong trend to vote Democratic. Now, how do we explain this? It's all about selection. So what happened in the immigration to the United States is that the top tail of the Indian distribution was selected, and that's already above average in the US. On top of that, you have occupational choices. The occupational pattern for Indian Americans is very different from the mainstream, a lot more in computer science, management, and business, much less in low-income occupations. Again, going with the education. Indians have come for employment, so they're, in some sense, plugging into the job market much more readily. And they are, there's a little bit of, I guess, mismatch there, but Indians are much more fluent in English. Okay? And actually, this is where we're now going from economics to sociology. Indians actually have more stable family structures, high rates of marriage, low rates of divorce, and this also actually contributes to their economic success. So what's going to happen? Interestingly, Asians are projected to become the largest immigrant group by mid-century, and by 2065, they will constitute 38% of the immigrant population. Indian Americans are a major part of that, as I've noted. And Indian Americans, this is excluding Mexico, you can see that Indian Americans are settling all over the country. You saw that in the county map earlier too. That was the stock. This is the new flow. So you're going to see Indian Americans across the country. So Indian Americans are going to be visible in many ways that they've not been so far. In our book, we also tell individual stories. We have a lot of the book is actually about Taikon and Thai, and several of you are featured in the book, so you can look out for that. But we have the story of Indian Americans as a population, of you as a population, and what we're saying here is that that's going to keep developing. So just to recap, by the early 2010s, Indians were entering the US in unprecedented numbers. Okay? Over 100,000, and mostly through skill-based paths. And that has been obviously a key feature of their recent and increasing success. If these trends continue, then according to the projections, we'll have to write another book, and we'll call it The Other 2%, because the Indian American population will double as a proportion of the US population. But there's a lot of uncertainty. If we saw what happened with the Asiatic Barred Zone, if the political climate on immigration becomes more hostile, a lot of things can change. There's a long waiting period on permanent residency, and so it's very difficult to predict what the future will be. What we've at least done in the book is provide the first comprehensive, complete, data-driven story of our community in the United States. Thank you.